So in 40K, what is a W.A.C player? W-A-A-C. I've used this terminology here and there when we've been exploring some tournament play and some things to keep in mind. A W.A.C player is one that wins at all costs. And it's important to be aware that this type of player exists. And I have to say, as we dive into it, there are many ways to explore Warhammer 40,000. That is the ultimate amazing thing about this hobby. My one friend of mine, he plays 40K, if he's lucky, once a year. But he has thousands and thousands of professionally painted, beautiful, I mean, he's an amazing painter, an amazing converter. His whole hobby is he just loves to build, paint, and collect. And I'm like, I got to drag him out and be like, hey, let's play like an actual game on there. So he's exploring 40K from that whole universe. Then there's players maybe like myself. I enjoy painting. I enjoy collecting. It's a part of the hobby. But for me, I'm trying to recreate a narrative on the table. I'm trying to create like some Black Library stuff going on and really play around in the narrative of the Grimdark universe. And then likewise, there might be some players that they look at it as a pure tactical game, almost a chess game out there where is the narrative really important? They're going to play as they're going to play, very competitively and tournament geared. That's where we tend to see these W.A.C players, these win-at-all-cost players. And I say that because while there is no wrong way to play 40K, I believe it's important to represent yourself, the type of game that you expect. And of course, there's lots of crossover. You can have someone that's like, look, I'm into building, painting, and collecting. Good. I'm into the narrative like Fritz, playing that. Good. I'm into playing tournaments and really hyper competitive. Good. I mean, that's perfectly fine. When the other players know that, then there's no misunderstandings. So if I come to the game and I'm playing a narrative army, I'm playing a very narrative type army to fit in the Black Library, to fit in the Codex, to fit in the faction, and you show up with your W.A.C army and just obliterate me on everything, that's not really fun if I'm not aware of it. I feel powerless, like I can do nothing. But there have been times, recently with my Footdar list, in my own mind, in my own creation, for whatever reason, I've got this list that I'm playing a certain way. I want to try and do a certain thing. I played against a Space Marine player that his list was W.A.C, win at all costs. It was the most optimal. I mean, playing knights, playing everything in there. I knew what I was going into, and I got obliterated by turn 3. It was pretty much over. But I wanted to put some massive stress on my Footdar Eldar army, even though it's a narrative army, to really see. And we had a great time playing. It was time well spent on there. He got to blow up my stuff. I got to see a couple of really interesting points for my army, cut down my learning curve tremendously. But I knew what I was going into, and they knew what they were going into. You have to align yourself. The challenge with a W.A.C player is they are so hyper-competitive, almost to the point where they don't realize it. So they might not represent that. Or they might show up with an army that there's a little bit of a gray area. And the challenge here, of course, Games Workshop, being Games Workshop with the rules. I love 40K, but the rules are just out of control, a hot mess everywhere. And that's true of every edition. And it gets to be this big bloat. And then Games Workshop is like, okay, reset, new edition. Then we're good for a while. Then it goes on and on. And part of this, in all fairness, is their lack of rules clarity and their lack of ability to support an amazing rule system. But honestly, at the same time, there's a lot of factions. There's a lot of models. Chain of Command, World War II, fantastic rule set. Love it. When you play the American list or the Russians or the Germans or the British, you have a choice between like a couple of tanks, a couple of infantry configurations, and some support weapons, because that time period was very limited, very kind of like, here's what it is. Even in Battletech, which has massive diversity on there, the units are somewhat fixed. X-Wing miniatures, they're fixed. 40K, it's like there is so much stuff you can play. This is like a double-edged Vorpal sword. It's amazing that we can play so many units. That's before we pull into the White Dwarf stuff. That's before I start throwing down stuff from Blackstone Fortress on there. all sorts of crazy and wacky crossover. The only crossover we don't have at this moment is like I can bring in my Age of Sigmar stuff, and I'm sure Games Workshop is working on that. Open up some realm gate, and I'm in the grimdark far future on there. So what this leads to is rules that by their very nature of including everything makes it virtually impossible to balance. So a WA.A.C player looks and just says, right now at this moment, this alchemical configuration that we have, what is the most ruthless, optimal build for what I'm bringing to the table, what gets me the largest amount of dice, the most powerful strength out there, the best AP, the most wounds on there, what has the most synergy in terms of buffs or debuffs, and that's the only lens they look at through it. And right now, if that's Space Marines, it's Space Marines. For a time, that was Eldar. If it's just pure Imperial Knights, it's pure Imperial Knights. Whatever it is in that moment on there, that's what they're playing. So understanding that's the most important thing of when you walk into a gaming store, you walk into a gaming club and you're looking around, go in with the type of game that you want to play. And before you sit down to play a game with someone else, take into account their skill level. Take into account what type of game they want to play. Know that ahead of time. And sometimes you get a little tip-off based on the list or what they're looking for. And then decide, is this something I want to do? Be aware of it going in. And I think that is the place to be, because you won't feel out of control even if you get crushed, even if it's a mismatched game. And here's the crazy thing. The craziest thing in 40K right now, for me personally, looking at my past battles and looking at things, I'm a pretty decent Tyranid player. Tyranids don't really have ego, right? I'm a pretty good Hive commander on there. I have never beaten Dark Eldar with my Tyranids. Never. I was looking at the results, and I know I've never beaten them, but I'm like, maybe I haven't played them enough. This is through various editions, too, by the way. I have played my Tyranids against Dark Eldar 72 games over the various editions. And that's a pretty big number, because around here, the meta, Dark Eldar are not really that well represented on there. 72 games, and I've never beaten Dark Eldar. So that's, I'll still play against Dark Eldar. I'm still doing it. When I break that streak, when that happens, at that point, I'm never playing Dark Eldar again, because now my Tyranids are undefeated. And I've beaten Dark Eldar, and we're just never doing it. But I say that because even now when I go up against Dark Eldar, for whatever reason with my Tyranids, I'm aware of these things. I'm aware of it on there. So I think that's the important thing to realize in dealing with WA.A.C players in 40K, and honestly, to some extent, other wargaming systems too.